Book the Second, Chapter 3 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Second, Chapter 3. The Claims of Society. More than an hour after Allan had set forth on his exploring expedition through his own grounds, Midwinter rose, and enjoyed, in his turn, a full view, by daylight, of the magnificence of the new house. Refreshed by his long night's rest, he descended the great stair as cheerfully as Allan himself. One after another, he too looked into the spacious rooms on the ground floor in breathless astonishment at the beauty and the luxury which surrounded him. "The house where I lived in service when I was a boy was a fine one," he thought gaily, "but it was nothing to this. I wonder if Allan is as surprised and delighted as I am." The beauty of the summer morning drew him out through the open hall door, as it had drawn his friend out before him. He ran briskly down the steps, humming the burden of one of the old vagabond tunes which he had danced to long since in the old vagabond time. Even the memories of his wretched childhood took their color, on that happy morning, from the bright medium through which he looked back at them. "If I was not out of practice," he thought to himself, as he leaned on the fence and looked over at the park, "I could try some of my old tumbling tricks on that delicious grass." He turned and noticed two of the servants talking together near the shrubbery, and asked for the news of the master of the house. The men pointed with a smile in the direction of the gardens. Mr. Armadale had gone that way more than an hour since, and had met, as had been reported, with Miss Milroy in the grounds. Midwinter followed the path through the shrubbery, but on reaching the flower garden stopped, considered a little, and retraced his steps. "If Allan has met with the young lady," he said to himself, "Allan doesn't want me." He laughed as he drew that inevitable inference, and turned considerately to explore the beauties of Thorpe Ambrose on the other side of the house. Passing the angle of the front wall of the building, he descended some steps, advanced along a paved walk, turned another angle, and found himself in a strip of garden ground at the back of the house. Behind him was a row of small rooms situated on the level of the servants' offices. In front of him, on the further side of the little garden, rose a wall, screened by a laurel hedge, and having a door at one end of it, leading past the stables to a gate that opened on the high road. Perceiving that he had only discovered thus far the shorter way to the house used by the servants and tradespeople, Midwinter turned back again and looked in at the window of one of the rooms on the basement story as he passed it. Were those the servants' offices? No, the offices were apparently in some other part of the ground floor. The window he had looked in at was the window of a lumber room. The next two rooms in the row were both empty. The fourth window, when he approached it, presented a little variety. It served also as a door, and it stood open to the garden at that moment. Attracted by the bookshelves which he noticed on one of the walls, Midwinter stepped into the room. The books, few in number, did not detain him long. A glance at their backs was enough without taking them down. The Waverley novels, tales by Miss Edgeworth and by Miss Edgeworth's many followers, the poems of Mrs. Hemans, with a few odd volumes of the illustrated gift books of the period, composed the bulk of the little library. Midwinter turned to leave the room, when an object on one side of the window, which he had not previously noticed, caught his attention and stopped him. It was a statuette standing on a bracket, a reduced copy of the famous Niobe of the Florence Museum. He glanced from the statuette to the window, with a sudden doubt which set his heart throbbing fast. It was a French window. He looked out with a suspicion which he had not felt yet. The view before him was the view of a lawn and garden. For a moment his mind struggled blindly to escape the conclusion which had seized it, and struggled in vain. Here, close round him, and close before him, here, forcing him mercilessly back from the happy present to the horrible past, was the room that Allan had seen in the second vision of the dream. He waited, thinking and looking round him while he thought. There was wonderfully little disturbance in his face and manner. He looked steadily from one to the other of the few objects in the room, as if the discovery of it had saddened rather than surprised him. Matting of some foreign sort covered the floor. Two cane chairs and a plain table comprised the whole of the furniture. The walls were plainly papered and bare, broken to the eye in one place by a door leading into the interior of the house, in another by a small stove, in a third by the bookshelves which Midwinter had already noticed. He returned to the books, and this time he took some of them down the shelves. The first that he opened contained lines in a woman's handwriting, traced in ink that had faded with time. He read the inscription, "Jane Armadale, from her beloved father, Thorpe Ambrose, October, 1828." In the second, third, and fourth volumes that he opened, the same inscription reappeared. His previous knowledge of dates and persons helped him draw the true inference from what he saw. The books must have belonged to Allan's mother, and she must have inscribed them with her name, in the interval of time between her return to Thorpe Ambrose from Madeira and the birth of her son. Midwinter passed on to a volume on another shelf, one of a series containing the writings of Mrs. Hemans. In this case, the blank leaf at the edge of the book was filled on both sides with a copy of verses, the writing being still in Mrs. Armadale's hand. The verses were headed, "Farewell to Thorpe Ambrose," and were dated March 1829, 2 months only after Allan had been born. Entirely without merit in itself, the only interest of the little poem was in the domestic story that it told. The very room in which Midwinter then stood was described, with the view on the garden, the window made to open on it, the bookshelves, the niobe, and other more perishable ornaments which time had destroyed. Here, at variance with her brothers, shrinking from her friends, the widow of the murdered man had, on her own acknowledgment, secluded herself, without other comfort than the love and forgiveness of her father, until her child was born. The father's mercy and the father's recent death filled many verses, happily too vague in their commonplace expression of penitence and despair, to give any hint of the marriage story and Madeira to any reader who looked at them ignorant of the truth. A passing reference to the writer's estrangement from her surviving relatives, and to her approaching departure from Thorpe Ambrose, followed. Last came the assertion of the mother's resolution to separate herself from all her old associations, to leave behind her every possession, even to the most trifling thing she had, that could remind her of the miserable past, and to date her new life in the future from the birthday of the child who had been spared to console her, who was now the only earthly object that could still speak to her of love and hope. So the old story of passionate feeling that finds comfort in phrases rather than not find comfort at all was told once again. So the poem in the faded ink faded away to its end. Midwinter put the book back with a heavy sigh, and opened no other volume on the shelves. Here in the country house, or there on board the wreck, he said bitterly, the traces of my father's crime follow me, go where I may. He advanced toward the window, stopped, and looked back into the lonely, neglected little room. Is this chance? He asked himself. The place where his mother suffered is the place he sees in the dream, and the first morning in the new house is the morning that reveals it, not to him, but to me. Oh, Allan, Allan, how will it end? The thought had barely passed through his mind before he heard Allan's voice from the paved walk at the side of the house, calling to him by his name. He hastily stepped out into the garden. At the same moment, Allan came running round the corner, full of voluble apologies for having forgotten, in the society of his new neighbors, what was due to the laws of hospitality and the claims of his friend. "I really haven't missed you," said Midwinter, "and I'm very, very glad to hear that the new neighbors have produced such a pleasant impression on you already." He tried, as he spoke, to lead the way back by the outside of the house, but Allan's flighty attention had been caught by the open window and the lonely little room. He stepped in immediately. Midwinter followed, and watched him in breathless anxiety as he looked around. Not the slightest recollection of the dream troubled Allan's easy mind. Not the slightest reference to it fell from the silent lips of his friend. "Exactly the sort of place I should have expected you to hit on!" exclaimed Allan, gaily. "Small and snug and unpretending. I know you, Master Midwinter. You'll be slipping off here when the county families come visiting, and I rather think on those dreadful occasions you won't find me far behind you. What's the matter? You look ill and out of spirits. Hungry? Of course you are. Unpardonable of me to have kept you waiting. This door leads somewhere, I suppose. Let's try a short cut into the house. Don't be afraid of my not keeping you company at breakfast. I didn't eat much at the cottage. I feasted my eyes on Miss Milroy, as the poets say. Oh, the darling, the darling! She turns you topsy-turvy the moment you look at her. As for her father, wait till you see his wonderful clock. It is twice the size of the famous clock at Strasbourg, and the most tremendous striker ever heard yet in the memory of man. Singing praises of his new friends in this strain at the top of his voice, Allan hurried Midwinter along the stone passages of the basement floor, which led, as he had rightly guessed, to a staircase communicating with the hall. They passed the servants' offices on the way. At the sight of the cook and the roaring fire disclosed through the open kitchen door, Allan's mind went off at a tangent, and Allan's dignity scattered itself to the four winds of heaven as usual. "Aha, Mrs. Gripper! There you are with your pots and pans, and your burning fiery furnace. One had need be Shadrach or Meshach, and the other fellow to stand over that. Breakfast as soon as ever you like. Eggs, sausages, bacon, kidneys, marmalade, watercresses, coffee, and so forth. My friend and I belong to the select few whom it is a perfect privilege to cook for. Voluptuaries, Mrs. Gripper, voluptuaries, both of us. You'll see," continued Allan, as they went on towards the stairs. "I shall make that worthy creature young again. I'm better than a doctor for Mrs. Gripper. When she laughs, she shakes her fat sides; and when she shakes her fat sides, she exerts her muscular system; and when she exerts her muscular system, ha! Here's Susan again. Don't squeeze yourself flat against the banisters, my dear. If you don't mind hustling me on the stairs, I rather like hustling you. She looks like a full-blown rose when she blushes, doesn't she? Stop, Susan! I've orders to give. Be very particular with Mr. Midwinter's room. Shake up his bed like mad, and dust his furniture till those nice round arms of yours ache again. Nonsense, my dear fellow! I'm not too familiar with them. I'm only keeping them up to their work. Now then, Richard, where do we breakfast? Oh, here! Between ourselves, Midwinter, these splendid rooms of mine are a size too large for me. I don't feel as if I should ever be on intimate terms with my own furniture. My views in life are of the snug and slovenly sort. A kitchen chair, and a low ceiling. Man wants but little here below, and wants that little long. That's not exactly the right quotation, but it expresses my meaning, and will let alone correcting it till the next opportunity. "I beg your pardon," interposed Midwinter. "Here is something waiting for you which you have not noticed yet." As he spoke, he pointed a little impatiently to a letter lying on the breakfast table. He could conceal the ominous discovery which he had made that morning from Allan's knowledge, but he could not conquer the latent distrust of circumstances which was now raised again in his superstitious nature. The instinctive suspicion of everything that happened, no matter how common or how trifling the event, on the first memorable day when the new life began in the new house. Allan ran his eye over the letter, and tossed it across the table to his friend. "I can't make head or tail of it," he said. "Can you?" Midwinter read the letter slowly aloud. "Sir, I trust you will pardon the liberty I take in sending these few lines to wait your arrival at Thorpe Ambrose. In the event of circumstances not disposing you to place your law business in the hands of Mr. Darch—" He suddenly stopped at that point and considered a little. "Darch is our friend the lawyer," said Allan, supposing Midwinter had forgotten the name. "Don't you remember us pinning the half crown on the cabin table, when I got the two offers for the cottage? Heads the major, tails the lawyer. This is the lawyer." Without making any reply, Midwinter resumed reading the letter. "In the event of circumstances not disposing you to place your law business in the hands of Mr. Darch, I beg to say that I shall be happy to take charge of your interests, if you feel willing to honor me with your confidence. Enclosing a reference, should you desire it, to my agents in London, and again apologizing for this intrusion, I beg to remain, sir, respectfully yours, A. Pedgift, Sen." "Circumstances?" repeated Midwinter, as he laid the letter down. "What circumstance can possibly indispose you to give your law business to Mr. Darch?" "Nothing can indispose me," said Allan. "Besides being the family lawyer here, Darch was the first to write me word at Paris of my coming in for my fortune; and if I have got any business to give, of course he ought to have it." Midwinter still looked distrustfully at the open letter on the table. "I'm sadly afraid, Allan, there is something wrong already," he said. "This man would never have ventured on the application he has made to you, unless he had some good reason for believing he would succeed. If you wish to put yourself right at starting, you will send to Mr. Darch this morning to tell him you are here, and you will take no notice for the present of Mr. Pedgift's letter." Before more could be said on either side, the footman made his appearance with the breakfast tray. He was followed, after an interval, by the butler, a man of the essentially confidential kind, with a modulated voice, a courtly manner, and a bulbous nose. Anybody but Allan would have seen in his face that he had come into the room having a special communication to make to his master. Allan, who saw nothing under the surface, and whose head was running on the lawyer's letter, stopped him bluntly with the point blank question, "Who's Mr. Pedgift?" The butler's sources of local knowledge opened confidentially on the instant. Mr. Pedgift was the second of the two lawyers in the town; not so long established, not so wealthy, not so universally looked up to as old Mr. Darch; not doing the business of the highest people in the county, and not mixing freely with the best society, like old Mr. Darch; a very sufficient man in his way, nevertheless; known as a perfectly competent and respectable practitioner all round the neighborhood. In short, professionally next best to Mr. Darch, and personally superior to him, if the expression may be permitted, in this respect, that Darch was a crusty one, and Pedgift wasn't. Having imparted this knowledge, the butler, taking a wide advantage of his position, glided without a moment's stoppage from Mr. Pedgift's character to the business that had brought him into the breakfast room. The midsummer audit was near at hand, and the tenants were accustomed to have a week's notice of the rent day dinner. With this necessity pressing, and with no orders given as yet, and no steward in office at Thorpe Ambrose, it appeared desirable that some confidential person should bring the matter forward. The butler was that confidential person, and he now ventured accordingly to trouble his master on the subject. At this point Allan opened his lips to interrupt, and was himself interrupted before he could utter a word. "Wait," interposed Midwinter, seeing in Allan's face that he was in danger of being publicly announced in the capacity of steward. "Wait," he repeated eagerly, "till I can speak to you first." The butler's courtly manner remained alike unruffled by Midwinter's sudden interference and by his own dismissal from the scene. Nothing but the mounting color in his bulbous nose betrayed the sense of injury that animated him as he withdrew. Mr. Armadale's chance of regaling his friend and himself that day with the best wine in the cellar trembled in the balance, as the butler took his way back to the basement story. "This is beyond a joke, Allan," said Midwinter when they were alone. "Somebody must meet your tenants on the rent day who is really fit to take the steward's place. With the best will in the world to learn, it is impossible for me to master the business at a week's notice. Pray don't let your anxiety for my welfare put you in a false position with other people. I should never forgive myself if I was the unlucky cause—" "Gently, gently!" cried Allan, amazed at his friend's extraordinary earnestness. "If I write to London by to-night's post for the man who came down here before, will that satisfy you?" Midwinter shook his head. "Our time is short," he said, "and the man may not be at liberty. Why not try in the neighborhood first? You are going to write to Mr. Darch. Send at once, and see if he can't help us between this and post time." Allan withdrew to a side table on which writing materials were placed. "You shall breakfast in peace, you old fidget," he replied, and addressed himself forthwith to Mr. Darch, with his usual Spartan brevity of epistolary expression. "Dear Sir, here I am, bag and baggage. Will you kindly oblige me by being my lawyer? I ask this because I want to consult you at once. Please look in the course of the day, and stop to dinner if you possibly can. Yours truly, Allan Armadale." Having read this composition aloud, with unconcealed admiration of his own rapidity of literary execution, Allan addressed the letter to Mr. Darch, and rang the bell. "Here, Richard, take this at once, and wait for an answer. And I say, if there is any news stirring in the town, pick it up and bring it back with you. See how I manage my servants," continued Allan, joining his friend at the breakfast table. "See how I adapt myself to my new duties. I haven't been down here one clear day yet, and I'm taking an interest in the neighborhood already." Breakfast over, the two friends went out to idle away the morning under the shade of a tree in the park. Noon came, and Richard never appeared. 1 o'clock struck, and still there were no signs of an answer from Mr. Darch. Midwinter's patience was not proof against the delay. He left Allan dozing on the grass, and went to the house to make inquiries. The town was described as a little more than 2 miles distant, but the day of the week happened to be market day, and Richard was being detained, no doubt, by some of the many acquaintances whom he would be sure to meet with on that occasion. Half an hour later, the truant messenger returned, and was sent out to report himself to his master under the tree in the park. "Any answer from Mr. Darch?" asked Midwinter, seeing that Allan was too lazy to put the question for himself. "Mr. Darch was engaged, sir. I was desired to say that he would send an answer." "Any news in the town?" inquired Allan, drowsily, without troubling himself to open his eyes. "No, sir, nothing in particular." Observing the man suspiciously as he made that reply, Midwinter detected in his face that he was not speaking the truth. He was plainly embarrassed, and plainly relieved when his master's silence allowed him to withdraw. After a little consideration, Midwinter followed, and overtook the retreating servant on the drive before the house. "Richard," he said, quietly, "if I was to guess that there is some news in the town, and that you don't like telling it to your master, should I be guessing the truth?" The man started and changed color. "I don't know how you have found it out," he said, "but I can't deny you have guessed right. If you let me hear what the news is, I will take the responsibility on myself of telling Mr. Armadale." After some little hesitation, and some distrustful consideration on his side of Midwinter's face, Richard at last prevailed on himself to repeat what he had heard that day in the town. The news of Allan's sudden appearance at Thorpe Ambrose had preceded the servant's arrival at his destination by some hours. Wherever he went, he found his master the subject of public discussion. The opinion of Allan's conduct among the leading townspeople, the resident gentry of the neighborhood, and the principal tenants on the estate was unanimously unfavorable. Only the day before, the committee for managing the public reception of the new squire had sketched the progress of the procession, had settled the serious question of the triumphal arches, and had appointed a competent person to solicit subscriptions for the flags, the flowers, the feasting, the fireworks, and the band. In less than a week more of the money could have been collected, and the rector would have written to Mr. Armadale to fix the day. And now, by Allan's own act, the public welcome waiting to honor him had been cast back contemptuously in the public teeth. Everybody took for granted, and what was unfortunately true, that he had received private information of the contemplated proceedings. Everybody declared that he had purposely stolen into his own house like a thief in the night, so the phrase ran, to escape accepting the offered civilities of his neighbors. In brief, the sensitive self importance of the little town was wounded to the quick, and of Allan's once enviable position in the estimation of the neighborhood not a vestige remained. For a moment, Midwinter faced the messenger of evil tidings in silent distress. That moment past, the sense of Allan's critical position roused him. Now the evil was known, to seek the remedy. "Has the little you have seen of your master, Richard, inclined you to like him?" This time the man answered without hesitation. A pleasanter and kinder gentleman than Mr. Armadale no one could wish to serve. "If you think that," pursued Midwinter, "you won't object to give me some information which will help your master to set himself right with his neighbors. Come into the house." He led the way into the library, and after asking the necessary questions, took down in writing a list of the names and addresses of the most influential persons living in the town and its neighborhood. This done, he rang the bell for the head footman, having previously sent Richard with a message to the stables, directing an open carriage to be ready in an hour's time. When the late Mr. Blanchard went out to make calls in the neighborhood, it was your place to go with him, was it not?" he asked, when the upper servant appeared. "Very well. Be ready in an hour's time, if you please, to go out with Mr. Armadale." Having given that order, he left the house again on his way back to Allan, with the visiting list in his hand. He smiled a little sadly as he descended the steps. "Who would have imagined," he thought, "that my footboy's experience of the ways of gentlefolks would be worth looking back at one day for Allan's sake?" The object of the popular odium lay innocently slumbering on the grass, with his garden hat over his nose, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and his trousers wrinkled halfway up his outstretched legs. Midwinter roused him without hesitation, and remorselessly repeated the servant's news. Allan accepted the disclosure thus forced on him without the slightest disturbance of temper. "Oh, hang them!" was all he said. "Let's have another cigar." Midwinter took the cigar out of his hand, and, insisting on his treating the matter seriously, told him in plain words that he must set himself right with his offended neighbors by calling on them personally to make his apologies. Allan sat up on the grass in astonishment. His eyes opened wide in incredulous dismay. Did Midwinter positively meditate forcing him into a chimney-pot hat, a nicely brushed frock-coat, and a clean pair of gloves? Was it actually in contemplation to shut him up in a carriage, with his footman on the box and his card-case in his hand, and send him round from house to house, to tell a pack of fools that he begged their pardon for not letting them make a public show of him? If anything so outrageously absurd as this was really to be done, it could not be done that day, at any rate. He had promised to go back to the charming Milroy at the cottage, and to take Midwinter with him. What earthly need had he of the good opinion of the resident gentry? The only friends he wanted were the friends he had got already. Let the whole neighborhood turn its back on him if it liked, back or face. The Squire of Thorpe Ambrose didn't care two straws about it. After allowing him to run on in this way until his whole stock of objections was exhausted, Midwinter wisely tried his personal influence next. He took Allan affectionately by the hand. "I'm going to ask a great favor," he said. "If you won't call on these people for your own sake, will you call on them to please me?" Allan delivered himself of a groan of despair, stared in mute surprise at the anxious face of his friend, and good humoredly gave way. As Midwinter took his arm and led him back to the house, he looked round with rueful eyes at the cattle hard by, placidly whisking their tails in the pleasant shade. "Don't mention it in the neighborhood," he said. "I should like to change places with one of my own cows." Midwinter left him to dress, engaging to return when the carriage was at the door. Allan's toilet did not promise to be a speedy one. He began it by reading his own visiting cards, and he advanced it a second stage by looking into his wardrobe and devoting the resident gentry to the infernal regions. Before he could discover any third means of delaying his own proceedings, the necessary pretext was unexpectedly supplied by Richard's appearance with a note in his hand. The messenger had just called with Mr. Darch's answer. Allan briskly shut up the wardrobe, and gave his whole attention to the lawyer's letter. The lawyer's letter rewarded him by the following lines: "Sir, I beg to acknowledge the receipt of your favor of today's date, honoring me with two proposals, namely, one, inviting me to act as your legal adviser, and one, inviting me to pay you a visit at your house. In reference to the first proposal, I beg permission to decline it with thanks. With regard to the second proposal, I have to inform you that circumstances have come to my knowledge relating to the letting of the cottage at Thorpe Ambrose, which render it impossible for me, in justice to myself, to accept your invitation. I have ascertained, sir, that my offer reached you at the same time as Major Milroy's, and that, with both proposals thus before you, you gave the preference to a total stranger, who addressed you through a house agent, over a man who had faithfully served your relatives for 2 generations, and who had been the first person to inform you of the most important event in your life. After this specimen of your estimate of what is due to the claims of common courtesy and common justice, I cannot flatter myself that I possess any of the qualities which would fit me to take my place on the list of your friends. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, James Darch." "Stop the messenger!" cried Allan, leaping to his feet, his ruddy face aflame with indignation. "Give me pen, ink, and paper. By the Lord Harry, they are a nice set of people in these parts! The whole neighborhood is in a conspiracy to bully me." He snatched up the pen in a fine frenzy of epistolary inspiration. "Sir, I despise you and your letter." At that point the pen made a blot, and the writer was seized with a momentary hesitation. "Too strong," he thought. "I'll give it to the lawyer in his own cool and cutting style." He began again on a clean sheet of paper. "Sir, you remind me of an Irish bull. I mean that story in Joe Miller where Pat remarked, in the hearing of a wag hard by, that the reciprocity was all on one side. Your reciprocity is all on one side. You take the privilege of refusing to be my lawyer, and then you complain of my taking the privilege of refusing to be your landlord." He paused fondly over those last words. Neat, he thought. Argument and hard hitting both in one. I wonder where my knack of writing comes from." He went on, and finished the letter in two more sentences. "As for your casting my invitation back in my teeth, I beg to inform you my teeth are none the worse for it. I'm equally glad to have nothing to say to you, either in the capacity of a friend or a tenant. Allan Armadale." He nodded exultantly at his own composition as he addressed it, and sent it down to the messenger. "Darch's hide must be a thick one," he said, "if he doesn't feel that." The sound of the wheels outside suddenly recalled him to the business of the day. There was the carriage waiting to take him on his round of visits, and there was Midwinter at his post, pacing to and fro on the drive. "Read that!" cried Allan, throwing out the lawyer's letter. "I have written him back a smasher." He bustled away to the wardrobe to get his coat. There was a wonderful change in him. He felt little or no reluctance to pay the visits now. The pleasurable excitement of answering Mr. Darth had put him in a fine aggressive frame of mind for asserting himself in the neighborhood. "Whatever else they may say of me, they shan't say I was afraid to face them." Heated red hot with that idea, he seized his hat and gloves, and hurrying out of the room, met Midwinter in the corridor with the lawyer's letter in his hand. "Keep up your spirits!" cried Allan, seeing the anxiety in his friend's face, and misinterpreting the motive of it immediately. "If Darch can't be counted on to send us a helping hand into the steward's office, Pedgift can." "My dear Allan, I was not thinking of that. I was thinking of Mr. Darch's letter. I don't defend this so-tempered man, but I'm afraid we must admit he has some cause for complaint. Pray don't give him another chance of putting you in wrong. Where is your answer to this letter?" "Gone," replied Allan. "I always strike while the iron's hot. A word and a blow, and the blow first. That's my way. Don't, there's a good fellow, don't fidget about the steward's books and the rent day. Here's a bunch of keys they gave me last night. One of them opens the room where the steward's books are. Go in and read them till I come back. I give you my sacred word of honor, I'll settle it all with Pedgift before you see me again." "One moment," interposed Midwinter, stopping him resolutely on his way out to the carriage. "I say nothing against Mr. Pedgift's fitness to possess your confidence, for I know nothing to justify me in distrusting him. But he has not introduced himself to your notice in a very delicate way, and he has not acknowledged what is quite clear to my mind, that he knew of Mr. Darch's unfriendly feeling towards you when he wrote. Wait a little before you go to this stranger. Wait till we can talk it over together tonight." "Wait?" replied Allan. "Haven't I told you that I always strike while the iron's hot? Trust my eye for character, old boy. I'll look Pedgift through and through, and act accordingly. Don't keep me any longer, for heaven's sake. I'm in a fine humor for tackling the resident gentry, and if I don't go at once, I'm afraid it may wear off." With that excellent reason for being in a hurry, Allan boisterously broke away. Before it was possible to stop him again, he had jumped into the carriage and had left the house. End of Book the Second, Chapter 3. Book the Second, Chapter 4 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Second, Chapter 4. The March of Events. Midwinter's face darkened when the last trace of the carriage had disappeared from view. "I have done my best," he said, as he turned back gloomily into the house. "If Mr. Brock himself were here, Mr. Brock could do no more." He looked at the bunch of keys which Allan had thrust into his hand, and a sudden longing to put himself to the test over the steward's book took possession of his sensitive, self-tormenting nature. Inquiring his way to the room in which the various movables of the steward's office had been provisionally placed after the letting of the cottage, he sat down at the desk and tried how his own unaided capacity would guide him through the business records of the Thorpe Ambrose estate. The result exposed his own ignorance unanswerably before his own eyes. The ledgers bewildered him, the leases, the plans, and even the correspondence itself might have been written, for all he could understand of them, in an unknown tongue. His memory reverted bitterly, as he left the room again, to his 2 years' solitary self-instruction in the Shrewsbury bookseller's shop. "If I could only have worked at a business," he thought. "If I could only have known that the company of poets and philosophers was company too high for a vagabond like me!" He sat down alone in the great hall. The silence of it fell heavier and heavier on his sinking spirits. The beauty of it exasperated him, like an insult from a purse-proud man. "Curse the place," he said, snatching up his hat and stick. "I like the bleakest hillside I ever slept on better than I like this house." He impatiently descended the doorsteps, and stopped on the drive, considering by which direction he should leave the park for the country beyond. If he followed the road taken by the carriage, he might risk unsettling Allan by accidentally meeting him in the town. If he went out by the back gate, he knew his own nature well enough to doubt his ability to pass the room of the dream without entering it again. But one another way remained, the way which he had taken and then abandoned again in the morning. There was no fear of disturbing Allan and the major's daughter now. Without further hesitation, Midwinter set forth through the gardens to explore the open country on that side of the estate. Thrown off its balance by the events of the day, his mind was full of that sorely savage resistance to the inevitable self-assertion of wealth, so amiably deplored by the prosperous and the rich, so bitterly familiar to the unfortunate and the poor. "The Heatherwell costs nothing," he thought, looking contemptuously at the masses of rare and beautiful flowers that surrounded him, "and the buttercups and daisies are as bright as the best of you." He followed the artfully contrived ovals and squares of the Italian garden with a vagabond indifference to the symmetry of their construction and the ingenuity of their design. "How many pounds a foot did you cost?" he said, looking back with scornful eyes at the last path as he left it. wind away over high and low, like the sheep walk on the mountainside, if you can. He entered the shrubbery which Allan had entered before him, crossed the paddock and the rustic bridge beyond, and reached the major's cottage. His ready mind seized the right conclusion at the first sight of it, and he stopped before the garden gate to look at the trim little residence which would never have been empty, and would never have been let, but for Allan's ill-advised resolution to force the steward's situation on his friend. The summer afternoon was warm. The summer air was faint and still. On the upper and the lower floor of the cottage the windows were all open. From one of them, on the upper story, the sound of voices was startlingly audible in the quiet of the park, as Midwinter paused on the outer side of the garden enclosure. The voice of a woman, harsh, high, and angrily complaining. A voice with all the freshness and the melody gone, and with nothing but the hard power of it left, was discordantly predominant sound. With it, from moment to moment, there mingled the deeper and quieter tones, soothing and compassionate, of the voice of a man. Though the distance was too great to allow Midwinter to distinguish the words that were spoken, he felt the impropriety of remaining within hearing of the voices, and at once stepped forward to continue his walk. At the same moment, the face of a young girl, easily recognizable as the face of Miss Milroy from Allan's description of her, appeared at the open window of the room. In spite of himself, Midwinter paused to look at her. The expression of the bright young face which had smiled so prettily at Allan was weary and disheartened. After looking out absently over the park, she suddenly turned her head back into the room, her attention having been apparently struck by something that had just been said in it. "Oh, mamma, mamma!" she exclaimed, indignantly, "how can you say such things?" The words were spoken close to the window. They reached Midwinter's ears, and hurried him away before he heard more. But the self disclosure of Major Milroy's domestic position had not reached its end yet. As Midwinter turned the corner of the garden fence, a tradesman's boy was handing a parcel in at the wicket gate to the woman servant. "Well," said the boy, with the irrepressible impudence of his class, "how is the missus?" The woman lifted her hand to box his ears. "How is the missus?" she repeated, with an angry toss of her head, as the boy ran off. "If it would only please God to take the missus, it would be a blessing to everybody in the house." No such ill-omened shadow as this had passed over the bright domestic picture of the inhabitants of the cottage, which Allan's enthusiasm had painted for the contemplation of his friend. It was plain that the secret of the tenants had been kept from the landlord so far. 5 minutes more of walking brought Midwinter to the park gates. "Am I fated to see nothing and hear nothing to-day which can give me heart and hope for the future?" he thought, as he angrily swung back the lodge gate. "Even the people Allan has let the cottage to are people whose lives are embittered by a household misery which it is my misfortune to have found out." He took the first road that lay before him, and walked on, noticing little, immersed in his own thoughts. More than an hour passed before the necessity of turning back entered his mind. As soon as the idea occurred to him, he consulted his watch, and determined to retrace his steps so as to be at the house in good time to meet Allan on his return. 10 minutes of walking brought him back to a point at which three roads met, and one moment's observation of the place satisfied him that he had entirely failed to notice at the time by which of the three roads he had advanced. No signpost was to be seen. The country on either side was lonely and flat, intersected by broad drains and ditches. Cattle were grazing here and there, and a windmill rose in the distance above the pollard willows that fringed the low horizon. But not a house was to be seen, and not a human creature appeared on the visible perspective of any one of the three roads. Midwinter glanced back in the only direction left to look at, the direction of the road along which he had just been walking. There, to his relief, was the figure of a man, rapidly advancing toward him, of whom he could ask his way. The figure came on, clad from head to foot in dreary black, a moving blot on the brilliant white surface of the sun-brightened road. He was a lean, elderly, miserably respectable man. He wore a poor old black dress coat, and a cheap brown wig, which made no pretence of being his own natural hair. Short black trousers clung like attached old servants round his wizened legs, and rusty black gaiters hid all they could of his knobbed, ungainly feet. Black crape added its mite to the decayed and dingy wretchedness of his old beaver hat. Black mohair, in the obsolete form of a stock, drearily encircled his neck and rose as high as his haggard jaws. The one morsel of color he carried about him was a lawyer's bag of blue serge, as lean and limp as himself. The one attractive feature in his clean-shaven, weary old face was a neat set of teeth as honest as his wig, which said plainly to all inquiring eyes, "We pass our nights on his looking-glass, and our days in his mouth." All the little blood in the man's body faintly reddened his fleshless cheeks as Midwinter advanced to meet him, and asked the way to Thorpe Ambrose. His weak, watery eyes looked hither and thither in a bewilderment painful to see. If he had met with a lion instead of a man, and if the few words addressed to him had been words expressing a threat instead of a question, he could hardly have looked more confused and alarmed than he looked now. For the first time in his life, Midwinter saw his own shy uneasiness in the presence of strangers reflected, with tenfold intensity of nervous suffering, in the face of another man, and that man old enough to be his father. "Which do you please to mean, sir, the town or the house? I beg your pardon for asking, but they both go by the same name in these parts." He spoke with a timid gentleness of tone, an ingratiatory smile, and an anxious courtesy of manner, all distressingly suggestive of his being accustomed to receive rough answers in exchange for his own politeness from the persons whom he habitually addressed. "I was not aware that both the house and the town went by the same name," said Midwinter. "I meant the house." He instinctively conquered his own shyness as he answered in those words, speaking with a cordiality of manner which was very rare with him in his intercourse with strangers. The man of miserable respectability seemed to feel the warm return of his own politeness gratefully. He brightened and took a little courage. His lean forefinger pointed eagerly to the right road. "That way, sir," he said, "and when you come to two roads next, please take the left one of the two. I'm sorry I have business the other way, I mean in the town. I should have been happy to go with you and show you. Fine summer weather, sir, for walking. You can't miss your way if you keep to the left. Oh, don't mention it! I'm afraid I have detained you, sir. I wish you a pleasant walk back, and good morning." By the time he had made an end of speaking, under an impression apparently that the more he talked the more polite he would be, he had lost his courage again. He darted away down his own road, as if Midwinter's attempt to thank him involved a series of trials too terrible to confront. In 2 minutes more, his black retreating figure had lessened in the distance till it looked again what it had once looked already, a moving blot on the brilliant white surface of the sun brightened road. The man ran strangely in Midwinter's thoughts while he took his way back to the house. He was at a loss to account for it. It never occurred to him that he might have been insensibly reminded of himself when he saw the plain traces of past misfortune and present nervous suffering in the poor wretch's face. He blindly resented his own perverse interest in this chance foot passenger on the high road, as he had resented all else that had happened to him since the beginning of the day. "Have I made another unlucky discovery?" he asked himself impatiently. "Shall I see this man again, I wonder? Who can he be?" Time was to answer both those questions before many days more had passed over the inquirer's head. Allan had not returned when Midwinter reached the house. Nothing had happened but the arrival of a message of apology from the cottage. Major Milroy's compliments, and he was sorry that Mrs. Milroy's illness would prevent his receiving Mr. Armadale that day. It was plain that Mrs. Milroy's occasional fits of suffering or of ill temper created no more transitory disturbance of the tranquillity of the household. Drawing this natural inference after what he had himself heard at the cottage nearly 3 hours since, Midwinter withdrew into the library to wait patiently among the books until his friend came back. It was past 6 o'clock when the well known hearty voice was heard again in the hall. Allan burst into the library in a state of irrepressible excitement, and pushed Midwinter back unceremoniously into the chair from which he was just rising, before he could utter a word. "Here's a riddle for you, old boy!" cried Allan. "Why am I like the resident manager of the Augean stable, before Hercules was called in to sweep the litter out? Because I have had my place to keep up, and I have gone and made an infernal mess of it. Why don't you laugh? By George, he doesn't see the point. Let's try again. Why am I like the resident manager—" "For God's sake, Allan, be serious for a moment!" interposed Midwinter. You don't know how anxious I am to hear if you have recovered the good opinion of your neighbors." "That's just what the riddle was intended to tell you," rejoined Allan. "But if you will have it in so many words, my own impression is that you would have done better not to disturb me under that tree in the park. I have been calculating it to a nicety, and I beg to inform you that I have sunk exactly 3 degrees lower in the estimation of the resident gentry since I had the pleasure of seeing you last." "You will have your joke out," said Midwinter, bitterly. "Well, if I can't laugh, I can wait." "My dear fellow, I'm not joking. I really mean what I say. You shall hear what happened. You shall have a report in full of my first visit. It will do, I can promise you, as a sample for all the rest. Mind this: in the first place, I have gone wrong with the best possible intentions. When I started for these visits, I own I was angry with that old brute of a lawyer, and I certainly had a notion of carrying things with a high hand. But it wore off somehow on the road, and the first family I called on, I went in, as I tell you, with the best possible intentions. Oh dear, dear! There was the same spick and span reception room for me to wait in, with the neat conservatory beyond, which I saw again and again and again at every other house I went to afterward. There was the same choice selection of books for me to look at: a religious book, a book about the Duke of Wellington, a book about sporting, and a book about nothing in particular, beautifully illustrated with pictures. Down came papa with his nice white hair, and mamma with her nice lace cap. Down came young mister with the pink face and straw-colored whiskers, and young miss with the plump cheeks and the large petticoats. Don't suppose there was the least unfriendliness on my side. I always began with them in the same way. I insisted on shaking hands all round. That staggered them to begin with. When I came to the sore subject next, the subject of the public reception, I give you my word of honor, I took the greatest possible pains with my apologies. It hadn't the slightest effect. They let my apologies in at one ear and out at the other, and then waited to hear more. Some men would have been disheartened. I tried another way with them. I addressed myself to the master of the house, and put it pleasantly next. "The fact is," I said, "I wanted to escape the speechifying my getting up, and telling you to your face you're the best of men, and I beg to propose your health, and your getting up and telling me to my face I'm the best of men, and you beg to thank me, and so on, man after man, praising each other and pestering each other all round the table. That's how I put it, in an easy, light-handed, convincing sort of way. Do you think any of them took it in the same friendly spirit? Not one. It is my belief they had got their speeches ready for the reception, with the flags and the flowers, and that they are secretly angry with me for stopping their open mouths just as they were ready to begin. Anyway, whenever we came to the matter of the speechifying, whether they touched it first or I, down I fell in their estimation, the first of those 3 steps I told you of just now. Don't suppose I made no efforts to get up again. I made desperate efforts. I found they were all anxious to know what sort of life I had led before I came in for the Thorpe Ambrose property, and I did my best to satisfy them. And what came of it, do you think? Hang me if I didn't disappoint them for the second time. When they found out that I had actually never been to Eton or Harrow, or Oxford, or Cambridge, they were quite dumb with astonishment. I fancy they thought me a sort of outlaw. At any rate, they all froze up again, and down I fell the second step in their estimation. Never mind, I wasn't to be beaten. I had promised you to do my best, and I did it. I tried cheerful small talk about the neighborhood next. The women said nothing in particular. The men, to my unutterable astonishment, all began to condole with me. I shouldn't be able to find a pack of hounds, they said, within 20 miles of my house, and they thought it only right to prepare me for the disgracefully careless manner in which the Thorpe Ambrose covers had been preserved. I let them go on condoling with me, and then what do you think I did? I put my foot in it again. "Oh, don't take that to heart," I said. "I don't care two straws about hunting or shooting either. When I meet with a bird in my walk, I can't for the life of me feel eager to kill it. I rather like to see the bird flying about and enjoying itself." You should have seen their faces. They had thought me a sort of outlaw before. Now they evidently thought me mad. Dead silence fell upon them all, and down I tumbled the third step in general estimation. It was the same at the next house, and the next, and the next. The devil possessed us all, I think. It would come out, now in one way and now in another, that I couldn't make speeches, that I had been brought up without a university education, and that I could enjoy a ride on horseback without galloping after a wretched stinking fox or a poor distracted little hare. These three unlucky defects of mine are not excused, it seems, in a country gentleman, especially when he has dodged a public reception to begin with. I think I got on best, upon the whole, with the wives and daughters. The women and I always fell, sooner or later, on the subject of Mrs. Blanchard and her niece. We invariably agreed that they had done wisely in going to Florence, and the only reason we had to give for our opinion was that we thought their minds would be benefited, after their sad bereavement, by the contemplation of the masterpieces of Italian art. Every one of the ladies, I solemnly declare it, at every house I went to, came sooner or later to Mrs. and Miss Blanchard's bereavement and the masterpieces of Italian art. What we should have done without that bright idea to help us, I really don't know. The one pleasant thing at any of the visits was when we all shook our heads together and declared that the masterpieces would console them. As for the rest of it, there's only one thing more to be said. What I might be in other places, I don't know. I'm the wrong man in the wrong place here. Let me muddle on for the future in my own way, with my own few friends, and ask me anything else in the world, as long as you don't ask me to make any more calls on my neighbors." With that characteristic request, Allan's report of his exploring expedition among the resident gentry came to a close. For a moment, Midwinter remained silent. He had allowed Allan to run on from first to last without uttering a word on his side. The disastrous result of the visits, coming after what had happened earlier in the day, and threatening Allan, as it did, with exclusion from all local sympathies at the very outset of his local career, had broken down Midwinter's power of resisting the stealthily depressing influence of his own superstition. It was with an effort that he now looked up at Allan. It was with an effort that he roused himself to answer. "It shall be as you wish," he said, quietly. "I'm sorry for what has happened, but I'm not the less obliged to you, Allan, for having done what I asked you." His head sank on his breast, and the fatalist resignation which had once already quieted him on board the wreck now quieted him again. "What must be, will be," he thought once more. "What have I to do with the future, and what has he?" "Cheer up," said Allan. "Your affairs are in a thriving condition, at any rate. I paid one pleasant visit in the town, which I haven't told you of yet. I have seen Pedgift, and Pedgift's son, who helps him in the office. They are the two jolliest lawyers I ever met with in my life; and what's more, they can produce the very man you want to teach you the steward's business." Midwinter looked up quickly. Distrust of Allan's discovery was plainly written in his face already, but he said nothing. "I thought of you," Allan proceeded, "as soon as the two Pedgifts and I had had a glass of wine all round to drink to our friendly connection. The finest sherry I ever tasted in my life. I've ordered some of the same. But that's not the question just now. In 2 words, I told these worthy fellows your difficulty, and in 2 seconds old Pedgift understood all about it. 'I've got the man in my office,' he said, 'and before the audit day comes, I'll place him with the greatest pleasure at your friend's disposal.'" At this last announcement, Midwinter's distrust found its expression in words. He questioned Allan unsparingly. The man's name, it appeared, was Bashwood. He had been some time, how long Allan could not remember, in Mr. Pedgift's service. He had been previously steward to a Norfolk gentleman, name forgotten, in the westward district of the county. He had lost the steward's place through some domestic trouble in connection with his son, the precise nature of which Allan was not able to specify. Pedgift vouched for him, and Pedgift would send him to Thorpe Ambrose 2 or 3 days before the rent day dinner. He could not be spared, for office reasons, before that time. There was no need to fidget about it. Pedgift laughed at the idea of there being any difficulty with the tenants. 2 or 3 days' work over the steward's books, with a man to help Midwinter who practically understood that sort of thing, would put him all right for the audit, and the other business would keep till afterward. "Have you seen this Mr. Bashwood yourself, Allan?" asked Midwinter, still obstinately on his guard. "No," replied Allan. "He was out with the bag, as young Pedgift called it. They tell me he's a decent elderly man, a little broken by his troubles, and a little apt to be nervous and confused in his manners with strangers, but thoroughly competent and thoroughly to be depended on. Those are Pedgift's own words." Midwinter paused and considered a little, with a new interest in the subject. The strange man whom he had just heard described, and the strange man of whom he had asked his way where the three roads met, were remarkably like each other. Was this another link in the fast lengthening chain of events? Midwinter grew doubly determined to be careful, as the bare doubt that it might be so passed through his mind. "When Mr. Bashwood comes," he said, "will you let me see him and speak to him before anything definite is done?" "Of course I will," rejoined Allan. He stopped and looked at his watch. "And I'll tell you what I'll do for you, old boy, in the meantime," he added. "I'll introduce you to the prettiest girl in Norfolk. There's just time to run over to the cottage before dinner. Come along and be introduced to Miss Milroy." "You can't introduce me to Miss Milroy to day," replied Midwinter; and he repeated the message of apology which had been brought from the major that afternoon. Allan was surprised and disappointed, but he was not to be foiled in his resolution to advance himself in the good graces of the inhabitants of the cottage. After a little consideration, he hit on a means of turning the present adverse circumstances to good account. "I'll show a proper anxiety for Mrs. Milroy's recovery," he said, gravely. "I'll send her a basket of strawberries, with my best respects, tomorrow morning." Nothing more happened to mark the end of that first day in the new house. The one noticeable event of the next day was another disclosure of Mrs. Milroy's infirmity of temper. Half an hour after Allan's basket of strawberries had been delivered at the cottage, it was returned to him intact, by the hands of the invalid lady's nurse, with a short and sharp message, shortly and sharply delivered. Mrs. Milroy's compliments and thanks. Strawberries invariably disagreed with her. If this curiously petulant acknowledgment of an act of politeness was intended to irritate Allan, it failed entirely in accomplishing its object. Instead of being offended with the mother, he sympathized with the daughter. "Poor little thing," was all he said. "She must have a hard life of it, with such a mother as that." He called at the cottage himself later in the day, but Miss Milroy was not to be seen. She was engaged upstairs. The major received his visitor in his working apron, far more deeply immersed in his wonderful clock, and far less readily accessible to outer influences, than Allan had seen him at their first interview. His manner was as kind as before, but not a word more could be extracted from him on the subject of his wife than that Mrs. Milroy had not improved since yesterday. The 2 next days passed quietly and uneventfully. Allan persisted in making his inquiries at the cottage, but all he saw of the major's daughter was a glimpse of her on one occasion at a window on the bedroom floor. Nothing more was heard from Mr. Pedgift, and Mr. Bashwood's appearance was still delayed. Midwinter declined to move in the matter until time enough had passed to allow of his first hearing from Mr. Brooke, in answer to the letter which he had addressed to the rector on the night of his arrival at Thorpe Ambrose. He was unusually silent and quiet, and passed most of his hours in the library among the books. The time wore on wearily. The resident gentry acknowledged Allan's visit by formally leaving their cards. Nobody came near the house afterward. The weather was monotonously fine. Allan grew a little restless and dissatisfied. He began to resent Mrs. Milroy's illness. He began to think regretfully of his deserted yacht. The next day, the 20th, brought some news with it from the outer world. A message was delivered from Mr. Pedgift, announcing that his clerk, Mr. Bashwood, would personally present himself at Thorpe Ambrose on the following day, and a letter in answer to Midwinter was received from Mr. Brock. The letter was dated the 18th, and the news which it contained raised not Allan's spirits only, but Midwinter's as well. On the day on which he wrote, Mr. Brock announced that he was about to journey to London, having been summoned thither on business connected with the interests of a sick relative, to whom he stood in the position of trustee. The business completed, he had good hope of finding one or other of his clerical friends in the metropolis who would be able and willing to do duty for him at the rectory, and in that case he trusted to travel on from London to Thorpe Ambrose in a week's time or less. Under these circumstances, he would leave the majority of the subjects on which Midwinter had written to him to be discussed when they met. But as time might be of importance in relation to the stewardship of the Thorpe Ambrose estate, he would say at once that he saw no reason why Midwinter should not apply his mind to learning the steward's duties, and should not succeed in rendering himself invaluably serviceable in that way to the interests of his friend. Leaving Midwinter reading and rereading the rector's cheering letter, as if he was bent on getting every sentence in it by heart, Allan went out rather earlier than usual, to make his daily inquiry at the cottage, or, in plainer words, to make a fourth attempt at improving his acquaintance with Miss Milroy. The day had begun encouragingly, and encouragingly it seemed destined to go on. When Allan turned the corner of the second shrubbery and entered the little paddock where he and the major's daughter had first met, there was Miss Milroy herself, loitering to and fro on the grass, to all appearance on the watch for somebody. She gave a little start when Allan appeared, and came forward without hesitation to meet him. She was not in her best looks. Her rosy complexion had suffered under confinement to the house, and a marked expression of embarrassment clouded her pretty face. "I hardly know how to confess it, Mr. Armadale," she said, speaking eagerly, before Allan could utter a word, "but I certainly ventured here this morning in the hope of meeting with you. I have been very much distressed. I have only just heard, by accident, of the manner in which mamma received the present of fruit you so kindly sent to her. Will you try to excuse her? She has been miserably ill for years, and she is not always quite herself. After your being so very, very kind to me and to papa, I really could not help stealing out here in the hope of seeing you, and telling you how sorry I was. Pray forgive and forget, Mr. Armadale. Pray do." Her voice faltered over the last words, and in her eagerness to make her mother's peace with him, she laid her hand on his arm. Allan was himself a little confused. Her earnestness took him by surprise, and her evident conviction that he had been offended honestly distressed him. Not knowing what else to do, he followed his instincts, and possessed himself of her hand to begin with. "My dear Miss Milroy, if you say a word more, you will distress me next," he rejoined, unconsciously pressing her hand closer and closer, in the embarrassment of the moment. "I never was in the least offended. I made allowances, upon my honor I did, for poor Mrs. Milroy's illness." "Offended? cried Allan, reverting energetically to the old complimentary strain. "I should like to have my basket of fruit sent back every day, if I could only be sure of its bringing you out into the paddock the first thing in the morning." Some of Miss Milroy's missing color began to appear again in her cheeks. "Oh, Mr. Armadale, there is really no end to your kindness," she said. "You don't know how you relieve me." She paused. Her spirits rallied with as happy a readiness of recovery as if they had been the spirits of a child, and her native brightness of temper sparkled again in her eyes as she looked up, shyly smiling, in Allan's face. "Don't you think," she asked, demurely, "that it is almost time now to let go of my hand?" Their eyes met. Allan followed his instincts for the second time. Instead of releasing her hand, he lifted it to his lips and kissed it. All the missing tints of the rosier sort returned to Miss Milroy's complexion on the instant. She snatched away her hand as if Allan had burned it. "I'm sure that's wrong, Mr. Armadale," she said, and turned her head aside quickly, for she was smiling in spite of herself. "I meant it as an apology for holding your hand too long," stammered Allan. "An apology can't be wrong, can it?" "There are occasions, though not many, when the female mind accurately appreciates an appeal to the force of pure reason. This was one of the occasions. An abstract proposition had been presented to Miss Milroy, and Miss Milroy was convinced. If it was meant as an apology, that, she admitted, made all the difference. "I only hope," said the little goat, looking at him shyly, "you are not misleading me. Not that it matters much now," she added, with a serious shake of her head. "If we have committed any improprieties, Mr. Armadale, we are not likely to have the opportunity of committing many more." "You are not going away?" exclaimed Allan, in great alarm. "Worse than that, Mr. Armadale. My new governess is coming." "Coming?" repeated Allan. "Coming already?" "As good as coming, I ought to have said, only I didn't know you wished me to be so very particular. We got the answers to the advertisements this morning. Papa and I opened them and read them together half an hour ago, and we both picked out the same letter from all the rest. I picked it out because it was so prettily expressed, and Papa picked it out because the terms were so reasonable. He is going to send the letter up to Grandmamma in London by today's post, and if she finds everything satisfactory on inquiry, the governess is to be engaged. You don't know how dreadfully nervous I am getting about it already. A strange governess is such an awful prospect. But it is not quite so bad as going to school, and I have great hopes in this new lady, because she writes such a nice letter. As I said to Papa, it almost reconciles me to her horrid, unromantic name." "What's her name?" asked Allan. "Brown? Grubb? Scraggs? Anything of that sort?" "Hush! Hush! Nothing quite so horrible as that. Her name is Gwilt. Dreadfully unpoetical, isn't it? Her reference must be a respectable person, though, for she lives in the same part of London as Grandmamma. Stop, Mr. Armadale! We are going the wrong way." "No, I can't wait to look at those lovely flowers of yours this morning, and many thanks. I can't accept your arm. I have stayed here too long already. Papa is waiting for his breakfast, and I must run back every step of the way. Thank you for making those kind allowances for mamma. Thank you again and again, and good bye." "Won't you shake hands?" asked Allan. She gave him her hand. "No more apologies, if you please, Mr. Armadale," she said, saucily. Once more their eyes met, and once more the plump, dimpled little hand found its way to Allan's lips. "It isn't an apology this time," cried Allan, precipitately defending himself. It's a mark of respect." She started back a few steps and burst out laughing. "You won't find me in our grounds again, Mr. Armadale," she said, merrily, "till I have got Miss Gwilt to take care of me." With that farewell, she gathered up her skirts and ran back across the paddock at the top of her speed. Allan stood watching her in speechless admiration till she was out of sight. His second interview with Miss Milroy had produced an extraordinary effect on him. For the first time since he had become the master of Thorpe Ambrose, he was absorbed in serious consideration of what he owed to his new position in life. "The question is," pondered Allan, "whether I hadn't better set myself right with my neighbors by becoming a married man. I shall take the day to consider, and if I keep in the same mind about it, I'll consult Midwinter to-morrow morning." When the morning came, and when Allan descended to the breakfast room, resolute to consult his friend on the obligations that he owed to his neighbors in general, and to Miss Milroy in particular, no Midwinter was to be seen. On making inquiry, it appeared that he had been observed in the hall, that he had taken from the table a letter which the morning's post had brought to him, and that he had gone back immediately to his own room. Allan at once ascended the stairs again, and knocked at his friend's door. "May I come in?" he asked. "Not just now," was the answer. "You have got a letter, haven't you?" persisted Allan. "Any bad news? Anything wrong?" "Nothing. I'm not very well this morning. Don't wait breakfast for me. I'll come down as soon as I can." No more was said on either side. Allan returned to the breakfast room, a little disappointed. He had set his heart on rushing headlong into his consultation with Midwinter, and here was the consultation indefinitely delayed. "What an odd fellow he is!" thought Allan. "What on earth can he be doing, locked in there by himself?" He was doing nothing. He was sitting by the window, with the letter which had reached him that morning open in his hand. The handwriting was Mr. Brock's, and the words written were these: "My dear Midwinter, I have literally only 2 minutes before post time to tell you that I have just met, in Kensington Gardens, with the woman whom we both only know thus far as the woman with the red Paisley shawl. I have traced her and her companion, a respectable looking elderly lady, to their residence, after having distinctly heard Allan's name mentioned between them. Depend on my not losing sight of the woman until I am satisfied that she means no mischief at Thorpe Ambrose, and expect to hear from me again as soon as I know how this strange discovery is to end. Very truly yours, Decimus Brock." After reading the letter for the second time, Midwinter folded it up thoughtfully and placed it in his pocket-book, side by side with the manuscript narrative of Allan's dream. "Your discovery will not end with you, Mr. Brock," he said. "Do what you will with the woman, when the time comes the woman will be here." End of chapter 4.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins, Book the Second, Chapter 5. Mother Oldershaw on her guard. 1. From Mrs. Oldershaw, Diana Street, Pimlico, to Miss Gwilt, West Place, Old Brompton. Ladies' Toilet Repository, June 20th, 8 in the evening. My dear Lydia, about 3 hours have passed, as well as I can remember, since I pushed you unceremoniously inside my house in West Place, and merely telling you to wait till you saw me again, banged the door to between us, and left you alone in the hall. I know your sensitive nature, my dear, and I am afraid you have made up your mind by this time that never yet was a guest treated so abominably by her hostess as I have treated you. The delay that has prevented me from explaining my strange conduct is, believe me, a delay for which I am not to blame. One of the many delicate little difficulties which beset so essentially confidential a business as mine occurred here, as I have since discovered, while we were taking the air this afternoon in Kensington Gardens. I see no chance of being able to get back to you for some hours to come, and I have a word of very urgent caution for your private ear, which has been too long delayed already. So I must use the spare minutes as they come and write. Here is caution the first. On no account venture outside the door again this evening, and be very careful, while the daylight lasts, not to show yourself at any of the front windows. I have reason to fear that a certain charming person now staying with me may possibly be watched. Don't be alarmed, and don't be impatient. You shall know why. I can only explain myself by going back to our unlucky meeting in the gardens with that reverend gentleman who was so obliging as to follow us both back to my house. It crossed my mind, just as we were close to the door, that there might be a motive for the parson's anxiety to trace us home, far less creditable to his taste, and far more dangerous to both of us, than the motive you supposed him to have. In plainer words, Lydia, I rather doubted whether you had met with another admirer, and I strongly suspected that you had encountered another enemy instead. There was no time to tell you this. There was only time to see you safe into the house, and to make sure of the parson, in case my suspicions were right, by treating him as he had treated us. I mean, by following him in his turn. I kept some little distance behind him at first, to turn the thing over in my mind, and to be satisfied that my doubts were not misleading me. We have no concealments from each other, and you shall know what my doubts were. I was not surprised at your recognizing him. He is not at all a common-looking old man, and you had seen him twice in Somersetshire, once when you asked your way of him to Mrs. Armadale's house, and once when you saw him again on your way back to the railroad. But I was a little puzzled, considering that you had your veil down on both these occasions, and your veil down also when we were in the gardens, at his recognizing you. I doubted his remembering your figure in a summer dress after he had only seen it in a winter dress, and though we were talking when he met us, and your voice is one among your many charms, I doubted his remembering your voice either, and yet I felt persuaded that he knew you. How, you will ask? My dear, as ill luck would have it, we were speaking at the time of young Armadale. I firmly believe that the name was the first thing that struck him, and when he heard that, your voice certainly, and your figure perhaps, came back into his memory. And what if it did, you may say? Think again, Lydia, and tell me whether the parson of the place where Mrs. Armadale lived was not likely to be Mrs. Armadale's friend. If he was her friend, the very first person to whom she would apply for advice after the manner in which you frightened her, and after what you most injudiciously said on the subject of appealing to her son, would be the clergyman of the parish, and the magistrate too, as the landlord at the inn himself told you. You will now understand why I left you in that extremely uncivil manner, and I may go on to what happened next. I followed the old gentleman till he turned into a quiet street, and then accosted him with respect for the church, written, I flatter myself, in every line of my face. "Will you excuse me," I said, "if I venture to inquire, sir, whether you recognized the lady who was walking with me when you happened to pass us in the gardens?" "Will you excuse my asking, ma'am, why you put that question?" was all the answer I got. "I will endeavor to tell you, sir," I said. If my friend is not an absolute stranger to you, I should wish to request your attention to a very delicate subject, connected with a lady deceased, and with her son who survives her." He was staggered, I could see that; but he was sly enough at the same time to hold his tongue and wait till I said something more. "If I am wrong, sir, in thinking that you recognized my friend," I went on, "I beg to apologize; but I could hardly suppose it possible that a gentleman in your profession would follow a lady home who was a total stranger to him." There I had him. He colored up (fancy that, at his age!) and owned the truth, in defense of his own precious character. "I have met with the lady once before, and I acknowledge that I recognized her in the gardens," he said. "You will excuse me if I decline entering into the question of whether I did or did not purposely follow her home. If you wish to be assured that your friend is not an absolute stranger to me, you now have that assurance. And if you have anything particular to say to me, I leave you to decide whether the time has come to say it." He waited and looked about. I waited and looked about. He said the street was hardly a fit place to speak of a delicate subject in. I said the street was hardly a fit place to speak of a delicate subject in. He didn't offer to take me to where he lived. I didn't offer to take him to where I lived. Have you ever seen two strange cats, my dear, nose to nose on the tiles? If you have seen the parson and me done to the life. "Well, ma'am," he said at last, "shall we go on with our conversation in spite of circumstances?" "Yes, sir," I said. "We are both of us, fortunately, of an age to set circumstances at defiance." I had seen the old wretch looking at my gray hair, and satisfying himself that his character was safe if he was seen with me. After all this snapping and snarling, we came to the point at last. I began by telling him that I feared his interest in you was not of the friendly sort. He admitted that much, of course in defense of his own character once more. I next repeated to him everything you had told me about your proceedings in Somersetshire, when we first found that he was following us home. Don't be alarmed, my dear, I was acting on principle. If you want to make a dish of lies digestible, always give it a garnish of truth. Well, having appealed to the reverend gentleman's confidence in this matter, I next declared that you had become an altered woman since he had seen you last. I revived that dead wretch, your husband, without mentioning names, of course, established him (the first place I thought of) in business at the Brazils, and described a letter which he had written, offering to forgive his erring wife if she would repent and go back to him. I assured the parson that your husband's noble conduct had softened your obdurate nature; and then, thinking I had produced the right impression, I came boldly to close quarters with him. I said, "At the very time when you met us, sir, my unhappy friend was speaking in terms of touching self-reproach of her conduct to the late Mrs. Armadale. She confided to me her anxiety to make some atonement, if possible, to Mrs. Armadale's son; and it is at her entreaty, for she cannot prevail on herself to face you, that I now beg to inquire whether Mr. Armadale is still in Somersetshire, and whether he would consent to take back, in small installments, the sum of money which my friend acknowledges that she received by practicing on Mrs. Armadale's fears." Those were my very words. A neater story, accounting so nicely for everything, was never told. It was a story to melt a stone. But this Somersetshire parson is harder than stone itself. I blush for him, my dear, when I assure you that he was evidently insensible enough to disbelieve every word I said about your reformed character, your husband in the Brazils, and your penitent anxiety to pay the money back. It is really a disgrace that such a man should be in the Church. Such cunning as his is in the last degree unbecoming in a member of the sacred profession. "Does your friend propose to join her husband by the next steamer?" was all he condescended to say when I had done. I acknowledge I was angry. I snapped at him. I said, "Yes, she does." "How am I to communicate with her?" he asked. I snapped at him again. "By letter, through me." "At what address, ma'am?" There I had him once more. "You have found my address out for yourself, sir," I said. "The directory will tell you my name, if you wish to find that out for yourself also. Otherwise you are welcome to my card." "Many thanks, ma'am. If your friend wishes to communicate with Mr. Armadale, I will give you my card in return." "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, ma'am." "Good afternoon, sir." "Good afternoon, ma'am." So we parted. I went my way to an appointment at my place of business, and he went his in a hurry, which is of itself suspicious. What I can't get over is his heartlessness. Heaven help the people who send for him to comfort them on their deathbeds. The next consideration is, what are we to do? If we don't find out the right way to keep this old wretch in the dark, he may be the ruin of us at Thorpe Ambrose just as we are within easy reach of our end in view. Wait up till I come to you, with my mind free, I hope, from the other difficulty which is worrying me here. Was there ever such ill luck as ours? Only think of that man deserting his congregation and coming to London just at the very time when we have answered Major Milroy's advertisement, and may expect the inquiries to be made next week. I have no patience with him. His bishop ought to interfere. Affectionately yours, Maria Oldershaw. 2. From Miss Gwilt to Mrs. Oldershaw. West Place, June 20th. My poor old dear, how very little you know of my sensitive nature, as you call it. Instead of feeling offended when you left me, I went to your piano, and forgot all about you till your messenger came. Your letter is irresistible. I have been laughing over it till I am quite out of breath. Of all the absurd stories I ever read, the story you addressed to the Somersetshire clergyman is the most ridiculous. And as for your interview with him in the street, it is a perfect sin to keep it to ourselves. The public ought really to enjoy it in the form of a farce at one of the theatres. Luckily for both of us, to come to serious matters, your messenger is a prudent person. He sent upstairs to know if there was an answer. In the midst of my merriment, I had the presence of mind enough to send downstairs and say yes. Some brute of a man says in some book which I once read that no woman can keep two separate trains of ideas in her mind at the same time. I declare you have almost satisfied me that the man is right. What, when you have escaped unnoticed to your place of business, and when you suspect this house to be watched, you propose to come back here, and to put it in the parson's power to recover the lost trace of you? What madness! Stop where you are, and when you have got over your difficulty at Pimlico, it is some woman's business, of course. What worries women are! Be so good as to read what I have got to say about our difficulty at Brompton. In the first place, the house, as you supposed, is watched. Half an hour after you left me, loud voices in the street interrupted me at the piano, and I went to the window. There was a cab at the house opposite, where they let lodgings, and an old man, who looked like a respectable servant, was wrangling with the driver about his fare. An elderly gentleman came out of the house and stopped them. An elderly gentleman returned into the house, and appeared cautiously at the front drawing-room window. You know him, you worthy creature. He had the bad taste, some few hours since, to doubt whether you were telling him the truth. Don't be afraid, he didn't see me. When he looked up, after settling with the cab-driver, I was behind the curtain. I have been behind the curtain once or twice since, and I have seen enough to satisfy me that he and his servant will relieve each other at the window so as never to lose sight of your house here, night or day. That the parson suspects the real truth is of course impossible, but that he firmly believes I mean some mischief to young Armadale, and that you have entirely confirmed him in that conviction, is as plain as that 2 and 2 make 4. And this has happened, as you helplessly remind me, just when we have answered the advertisement, and when we may expect the Major's inquiries to be made in a few days' time. Surely here is a terrible situation for two women to find themselves in. A fiddlestick's end for the situation. We have got an easy way out of it, thanks, Mother Oldershaw, to what I myself forced you to do not 3 hours before the Somersetshire clergyman met with us. Has that venomous little quarrel of ours this morning, after we had pounced on the Major's advertisement in the newspaper, quite slipped out of your memory? Have you forgotten how I persisted in my opinion that you were a great deal too well known in London to appear safely as my reference in your own name, or to receive an inquiring lady or gentleman, as you were rash enough to propose, in your own house? Don't you remember what a passion you were in when I brought our dispute to an end by declining to stir a step in the matter, unless I could conclude my application to Major Milroy by referring him to an address at which you were totally unknown, and to a name which might be anything you pleased as long as it was not yours? What a look you gave me when you found there was nothing for it but to drop the whole speculation, or to let me have my own way! How you fumed over the lodging hunting on the other side of the park, and how you groaned when you came back, possessed of furnished apartments in respectable Bayswater, over the useless expense I had put you to! What do you think of those furnished apartments now, you obstinate old woman? Here we are, with discovery threatening us at our very door, and with no hope of escape unless we can contrive to disappear from the parson in the dark. And there are the lodgings in Bayswater, to which no inquisitive strangers have traced either you or me, ready and waiting to swallow us up, the lodgings in which we can escape all further molestation, and answer the major's inquiries at our ease. Can you see at last a little further than your poor old nose? Is there anything in the world to prevent your safe disappearance from Pimlico to-night, and your safe establishment at the new lodgings, in the character of my respectable reference, half an hour afterward? Oh, fie, fie, Mother Oldershaw! Go down on your wicked knees, and thank your stars that you had a she-devil like me to deal with this morning. Suppose we now come to the only difficulty worth mentioning, my difficulty. Watched as I am in this house, how am I to join you, without bringing the parson or the parson's servant with me at my heels? Being to all intents and purposes a prisoner here, it seems to me that I have no choice but to try the old prison plan of escape, a change of clothes. I have been looking at your housemaid. Except that we are both light, her face and hair and my face and hair are as unlike each other as possible, but she is as nearly as can be my height and size, and if she only knew how to dress herself and had smaller feet, her figure is a very much better one than it ought to be for a person in her station of life. My idea is to dress her in the clothes I wore in the gardens to-day, to send her out, with our reverend enemy, in full pursuit of her, and as soon as the coast is clear, to slip away myself and join you. The thing would be quite impossible, of course, if I had been seen with my veil up. But as events have turned out, it is one advantage of the horrible exposure which followed my marriage that I seldom show myself in public, and never, of course, in such a populous place as London, without wearing a thick veil and keeping that veil down. If the housemaid wears my dress, I don't really see why the housemaid may not be counted on to represent me to the life. The one question is, can the woman be trusted? If she can, send me a line telling her on your authority that she is to place herself at my disposal. I won't say a word till I have heard from you first. Let me have my answer to-night. As long as we were only talking about my getting the governess's place, I was careless enough how it ended. But now that we have actually answered Major Milroy's advertisement, I am in earnest at last. I mean to be Mrs. Armadale of Thorpe Ambrose, and woe to the man or woman who tries to stop me. Yours, Lydia Gwilt. P.S. I open my letter again to say that you need have no fear of your messenger being followed on his return to Pimlico. He will drive to a public house where he is known, will dismiss the cab at the door, and will go out again by a back way which is only used by the landlord and his friends. L.G. 3. From Mrs. Oldershaw to Miss Gwilt. Diana Street, 10 o'clock. My dear Lydia, you have written me a heartless letter. If you had been in my trying position, harassed as I was when I wrote to you, I should have made allowances for my friend when I found my friend not so sharp as usual. But the vice of the present age is a want of consideration for persons in the decline of life. Morally speaking, you are in a sad state, my dear, and you stand much in need of good example. You shall have a good example. I forgive you. Having now relieved my mind by the performance of a good action, suppose I show you next, though I protest against the vulgarity of the expression, that I can see a little further than my poor old nose. I will answer your question about the housemaid first. You may trust her implicitly. She has had her troubles, and has learned discretion. She also looks your age, though it is only her due to say that in this particular she has some years the advantage of you. I enclose the necessary directions which will place her entirely at your disposal. And what comes next? Your plan for joining me at Bayswater comes next. It is very well as far as it goes, but it stands sadly in need of a little judicious improvement. There is a serious necessity, you shall know why presently, for deceiving the parson far more completely than you propose to deceive him. I want him to see the housemaid's face under circumstances which will persuade him that it is your face; and then, going a step further, I want him to see the housemaid leave London, under the impression that he has seen you start on the first stage of your journey to the Brazils. He didn't believe in that journey when I announced it to him this afternoon in the street. He may believe in it yet, if you follow the directions as I am now going to give you. Tomorrow is Saturday. Send the housemaid out in your walking dress of today, just as you propose, but don't stir out yourself, and don't go near the window. Desire the woman to keep her veil down, to take half an hour's walk, quite unconscious, of course, of the parson or his servant at her heels, and then come back to you. As soon as she appears, send her instantly to the open window, instructing her to lift her veil carelessly and look out. Let her go away again after a minute or two, take off her bonnet and shawl, and then appear once more at the window, or better still, in the balcony outside. She may show herself again occasionally, not too often, later in the day. And tomorrow, as we have a professional gentleman to deal with, by all means send her to church. If these proceedings don't persuade the parson that the housemaid's face is your face, and if they don't make him readier to believe in your reformed character than he was when I spoke to him, I have lived 60 years, my love, in this vale of tears to mighty little purpose. The next day is Monday. I have looked at the shipping advertisements, and I find that a steamer leaves Liverpool for the Brazils on Tuesday. Nothing could be more convenient. We will start you on your voyage under the parson's own eyes. You may manage it this way. At 1 o'clock send out the man who cleans the knives and forks to get a cab, and when he has brought it up to the door, let him go back and get a second cab, which he is to wait in himself round the corner in the square. Let the housemaid, still in your dress, drive off, with the necessary boxes, in the first cab to the North Western Railway. When she is gone, slip out yourself to the cab waiting round the corner, and come to me at Bayswater. They may be prepared to follow your cab, to follow the housemaid's cab, because they have seen it at the door, but they won't be prepared to follow your cab because it has been hidden round the corner. When the housemaid has got to the station, and has done her best to disappear in the crowd, I have chosen the mixed train at 2:10 so as to give her every chance. You will be safe with me, and whether they do or do not find out that she does not really start for Liverpool won't matter by that time. They will have lost all trace of you, and they may follow the housemaid half over London if they like. She has my instructions enclosed, to leave the empty boxes, to find their way to the lost luggage office, and to go to her friends in the city and stay there till I write word that I want her again. And what is the object of all this? My dear Lydia, the object is your future security and mine. We may succeed or we may fail in persuading the parson that you have actually gone to the Brazils. If we succeed, we are relieved of all fear of him. If we fail, he will warn young Armadale to be careful of a woman like my housemaid, and not of a woman like you. This last gain is a very important one, for we don't know that Mrs. Armadale may not have told him your maiden name. In that event, the Miss Gwilt, whom he will describe as having slipped through his fingers here, will be so entirely unlike the Miss Gwilt established at Thorpe Ambrose as to satisfy everybody that it is not a case of similarity of persons, but only a case of similarity of names. What do you say now to my improvement on your idea? Are my brains not quite so addled as you thought them when you wrote? Don't suppose I'm at all over boastful about my own ingenuity. Cleverer tricks than this trick of mine are played off on the public by swindlers, and are recorded in the newspapers every week. I only want to show you that my assistance is not less necessary to the success of the Armadale speculation now than it was when I made our first important discoveries by means of a harmless-looking young man and the private inquiry office in Shadyside Place. There is nothing more to say that I know of, except that I am just going to start for the new lodging, with a box directed in my new name. The last expiring moments of Mother Oldershaw of the Toilet Repository are close at hand, and the birth of Miss Gwilt's respectable reference, Mrs. Mandeville, will take place in a cab in 5 minutes' time. I fancy I must be still young at heart, for I am quite in love already with my romantic name. It sounds almost as pretty as Mrs. Armadale of Thorpe Ambrose, doesn't it? Good night, my dear, and pleasant dreams. If any accident happens between this and Monday, write to me instantly by post. If no accident happens, you will be with me in excellent time for the earliest inquiries that the Major can possibly make. My last words are, don't go out, and don't venture near the front windows till Monday comes. Affectionately yours, M.O. End of Book the Second, Chapter 5. Recording by Dawn, Richmond, Virginia.
Book the Second, Chapter 6 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Anthony Petronic. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 6. Midwinter in Disguise. Toward noon on the day of the 21st, Miss Milroy was loitering in the cottage garden, released from duty in the sick room by an improvement in her mother's health, when her attention was attracted by the sound of voices in the park. One of the voices she instantly recognized as Allan's. The other was strange to her. She put aside the branches of a shrub near the garden palings, and, peeping through, saw Allan approaching the cottage gate, in company with a slim, dark, undersized man who was talking and laughing excitably at the top of his voice. Miss Milroy ran indoors to warn her father of Mr. Armadale's arrival, and to add that he was bringing with him a noisy stranger, who was, in all probability, the friend generally reported to be staying with the squire at the great house. Had the major's daughter guessed right? Was the squire's loud-talking, loud-laughing companion the shy, sensitive Midwinter of other times? It was even so. In Allan's presence that morning, an extraordinary change had passed over the ordinary, quiet demeanor of Allan's friend. When Midwinter had first appeared in the breakfast-room, after putting aside Mr. Brock's startling letter, Allan had been too much occupied to pay any special attention to him. The undecided difficulty of choosing the day for the audit dinner had pressed for a settlement once more, and had been fixed at last, under the butler's advice, for Saturday, the 28th of the month. It was only on turning round to remind Midwinter of the ample space of time which the new arrangement allowed for mastering the steward's books, that even Allan's flighty attention had been arrested by a marked change in the face that confronted him. He had openly noticed a change in his usual blunt manner, and had been instantly silenced by a fretful, almost an angry, reply. The two had sat down together to breakfast without the usual cordiality, and the meal had proceeded gloomily till Midwinter himself broke the silence by bursting into the strange outbreak of gaiety which had revealed in Allan's eye a new side to the character of his friend. As usual with most of Allan's judgments, here again the conclusion was wrong. It was no new side to Midwinter's character that now presented itself. It was only a new aspect of the one ever-recurring struggle of Midwinter's life. Irritated by Allan's discovery of the change in him, and dreading the next questions that Allan's curiosity might put, Midwinter had roused himself to efface, by main force, the impression which his own altered appearance had produced. It was one of those efforts which no men compass so resolutely as the men of his quick temper and his sensitive feminine organization. With his whole mind still possessed by the firm belief that the fatality had taken one great step nearer to Allan and himself since the rector's adventure in Kensington Gardens, with his face still betraying what he had suffered, under the renewed conviction that his father's deathbed warning was now, in event after event, asserting its terrible claim to part him, at any sacrifice, from the one human creature whom he loved, with the fear still busy at his heart that the first mysterious vision of Allan's dream might be a vision realized, before the new day that now saw the two Armadales together was a day that had passed over their heads, with these triple bonds, wrought by his own superstition, fettering him at that moment as they had never fettered him yet. He mercilessly spurred his resolution to the desperate effort of rivaling, in Allan's presence, the gaiety and good spirits of Allan himself. He talked and laughed, and heaped his plate indiscriminately from every dish on the breakfast table. He made noisily merry with jests that had no humor, and stories that had no point. He first astonished Allan, then amused him, then won his easily encouraged confidence on the subject of Miss Milroy. He shouted with laughter over the sudden development of Allan's views on marriage, until the servants downstairs began to think that their master's strange friend had gone mad. Lastly, he had accepted Allan's proposal that he should be presented to the Major's daughter, and judge of her for himself, as readily, nay, more readily, than it would have been accepted by the least diffident man living. There the two now stood at the cottage gate, Midwinter's voice rising louder and louder over Allan's. Midwinter's natural manner disguised, how madly and miserably none but he knew, in a coarse masquerade of boldness, the outrageous, the unendurable boldness of a shy man. They were received in the parlor by the Major's daughter, pending the arrival of the Major himself. Allan attempted to present his friend in the usual form. To his astonishment, Midwinter took the words flippantly out of his lips, and introduced himself to Miss Milroy with a confident look, a hard laugh, and a clumsy assumption of ease which presented him at his worst. His artificial spirits, lashed continuously into higher and higher effervescence since the morning, were now mounting hysterically beyond his own control. He looked and spoke with that terrible freedom of license which is the necessary consequence when a diffident man had thrown off his reserve of the very effort by which he has broken loose from his own restraints. He involved himself in a confused medley of apologies that were not wanted, and of compliments that might have overflattered the vanity of a savage. He looked backward and forward from Miss Milroy to Allan, and declared jocosely that he understood now why his friend's morning walks were always taken in the same direction. He asked her questions about her mother, and cut short the answers she gave him by remarks on the weather. In one breath, he said she must feel the day insufferably hot, and in another he protested that he quite envied her in her cool muslin dress. The Major came in. Before he could say 2 words, Midwinter overwhelmed him with the same frenzy of familiarity and the same feverish fluency of speech. He expressed his interest in Miss Milroy's health in terms which have been exaggerated on the lips of a friend of the family. He overflowed into a perfect flood of apologies for disturbing the Major at his mechanical pursuits. He quoted Allan's extravagant account of the clock, and expressed his own anxiety to see it in terms more extravagant still. He paraded his superficial book knowledge of the great clock at Strasbourg, with far-fetched jests on the extraordinary automaton figures which the clock puts in motion, on the procession of the 12 Apostles, which walks out under the dial at noon, and on the toy cock which crows at St. Peter's appearance, and this before a man who had studied every wheel in that complex machinery, and who had passed whole years of his life in trying to imitate it. "I hear you have outnumbered the Strasbourg Apostles, and outcrowded the Strasbourg cock," he exclaimed, with the tone and manner of friend habitually privileged to waive all ceremony. "And I am dying, absolutely dying, Major, to see your wonderful clock." Major Milroy had entered the room with his mind absorbed in his own mechanical contrivances as usual, but the sudden shock of Midwinter's familiarity was violent enough to recall him instantly to himself, and to make him master again, for the time, of his social resources as a man of the world. "Excuse me for interrupting you," he said, stopping Midwinter for the moment by a look of steady surprise. "I happen to have seen the clock at Strasbourg, and it sounds almost absurd in my ears, if you will pardon me for saying so, to put my little experiment in any light of comparison with that wonderful achievement. There is nothing else of the kind like it in the world." He paused to control his own mounting enthusiasm. The clock at Strasbourg was to Major Milroy what the name of Michelangelo was to Sir Joshua Reynolds. Mr. Armadale's kindness has led him to exaggerate a little, pursued the Major, smiling at Allan, and passing over another attempt of Midwinter's to seize on the talk, as if no such attempt had been made. But as there does happen to be this one point of resemblance between the great clock abroad and the little clock at home, that they both show what they can do on the stroke of noon, and as it is close on 12 now, if you still wish to visit my workshop, Mr. Winter, the sooner I show you the way to it, the better." He opened the door and apologized to Midwinter, with marked ceremony, for preceding him out of the room. "What do you think of my friend?" whispered Allan, as he and Miss Milroy followed. "Must I tell you the truth, Mr. Armadale?" she whispered back. "Of course." "Then I don't like him at all." "He's the best and dearest fellow in the world," rejoined the outspoken Allan. "You'll like him better when you know him better. I'm sure you will." Miss Milroy made a little grimace, implying supreme indifference to Midwinter, and saucy surprise at Allan's earnest advocacy of the merits of his friend. "Has he got nothing more interesting to say to me than that?" she wondered privately, "after kissing my hand twice yesterday morning?" They were all in the Major's workroom before Allan had the chance of trying a more attractive subject. There, on top of a rough wooden case which evidently contained the machinery, was the wonderful clock. The dial was crowned by a glass pedestal placed on rockwork in carved ebony, and on top of the pedestal sat the inevitable figure of Time, with his everlasting scythe in his hand. Below the dial was a little platform, and at either end of it rose two miniature sentry boxes, with closed doors. Externally, this was all that appeared, until the magic moment came when the clock struck 12 noon. It wanted then about 3 minutes to 12, and Major Milroy seized the opportunity of explaining what the exhibition was to be before the exhibition began. At the first words, his mind fell back again into its old absorption over the one employment of his life. He turned to Midwinter, who had persisted in talking all the way from the parlor, and who was talking still, without a trace left in his manner of the cool and cutting composure which he had spoken but a few minutes before. The noisy, familiar man, who had been an ill-bred intruder in the parlor, became a privileged guest in the workshop, for there he possessed the all-atoning social advantage of being new to the performances of the wonderful clock. "At the first stroke of 12, Mr. Midwinter," said the Major quite eagerly, "keep your eye on the figure of Time. He will move his scythe and point it downward to the glass pedestal. You will next see a little printed card appear behind the glass, which will tell you the day of the month and the day of the week. At the last stroke of the clock, Time will lift his scythe again into its former position, and the chimes will ring a peal. The peal will be succeeded by the playing of a tune, the favorite march of my old regiment, and then the final performance of the clock will follow. The sentry boxes, which you may observe at each side, will both open at the same moment. In one of them you will see the sentinel appear, and from the other a corporal and two privates will march across the platform to relieve the guard, and will then disappear, leaving the new sentinel at his post. I must ask your kind allowances for this last part of the performance. The machinery is a little complicated, and there are defects in it which, I am ashamed to say, I have not yet succeeded in remedying as I could wish. Sometimes the figures go all wrong, and sometimes they go all right. I hope they may do their best on the occasion of your seeing them for the first time." As the Major, posted near his clock, said the last words, his little audience of 3, assembled at the opposite end of the room, saw the hour hand and the minute hand on the dial point together to 12. The first stroke sounded, and Time, true to the signal, moved his scythe. The day of the month and the day of the week announced themselves in print through the glass pedestal next. Midwinter, applauding their appearance with a noisy exaggeration of surprise, which Miss Milroy mistook for coarse sarcasm directed at her father's pursuits, and which Allan, seeing that she was offended, attempted to moderate by touching the elbow of his friend. Meanwhile, the performances of the clock went on, and at the last stroke of 12, Time lifted his scythe again, the chimes rang, the march of the Major's old regiment followed, and the crowning exhibition of the relief of the guard announced itself in a preliminary trembling of the sentry boxes and a sudden disappearance of the Major at the back of the clock. The performance began with the opening of the sentry box on the right-hand side of the platform, as punctually as could be desired. The door on the other side, however, was less tractable. It remained obstinately closed. Unaware of this hitch in the proceedings, the corporal and his two privates appeared in their places in a state of perfect discipline, tottered out across the platform, all three trembling in every limb, dashed themselves headlong against the closed door on the other side, and failed in producing the smallest impression of the immovable sentry presumed to be within. An intermittent clicking of the major's keys and tools at work was heard in the machinery. The corporal and his two privates suddenly returned, backward, across the platform, and shut themselves up with a bang inside their own door. Exactly at that moment the other door opened for the first time, and the provoking sentry appeared with the utmost deliberation at his post, waiting to be relieved. He was allowed to wait. Nothing happened in the box but an occasional knocking inside the door, as if the corporal and his privates were impatient to be let out. The clinking of the major's tools was heard again among the machinery. The corporal and his party, suddenly restored to liberty, appeared in a violent hurry, and spun furiously across the platform. Quick as they were, however, the hitherto deliberate sentry on the other side now perversely showed himself to be quicker still. He disappeared like lightning into his own premises. The door closed smartly after him. The corporal and his privates dashed themselves headlong against it for the second time, and the major, appearing again round the corner of the clock, asked his audience innocently if they would be good enough to tell him whether anything had gone wrong. The fantastic absurdity of the exhibition, heightened by Major Milroy's grave inquiry at the end of it, was so irresistibly ludicrous that the visitors shouted with laughter, and even Miss Milroy, with all her consideration for her father's sensitive pride in his clock, could not restrain herself from joining in the merriment which the catastrophe of the puppets had provoked. But there are limits even to the license of laughter, and these limits were ere long so outrageously overstepped by one of the little party as to have the effect of almost instantly silencing the other two. The fever of Midwinter's false spirits flamed out into sheer delirium as the performance of the puppets came to an end. His paroxysms of laughter followed each other with such convulsive violence that Miss Milroy started back from him in alarm, and even the patient major turned on him with a look which said plainly, "Leave the room." Allan, wisely impulsive for once in his life, seized Midwinter by the arm, and dragged him out by main force into the garden, and thence into the park beyond. "Good heavens, what has come to you?" he exclaimed, shrinking back from the tortured face before him, as he stopped and looked close at it for the first time. For the moment, Midwinter was incapable of answering. The hysterical paroxysm was passing from one extreme to the other. He leaned against a tree, sobbing and gasping for breath, and stretched out his hand in a mute entreaty to Allan to give him time. "You had better not have nursed me through my fever," he said, faintly, as soon as he could speak. "I'm mad and I'm miserable. Allan, I have never recovered it. Go back and ask them to forgive me. I'm ashamed to go and ask them myself. I can't tell how it happened. I can only ask your pardon and theirs." He turned aside his head quickly, so as to conceal his face. "Don't stop here," he said. "Don't look at me. I shall soon get over it." Allan still hesitated, and begged hard to be allowed to take him back to the house. It was useless. "You break my heart with your kindness," he burst out passionately. "For God's sake, leave me by myself." Allan went back to the cottage, and pleaded there for indulgence to Midwinter with an earnestness and simplicity which raised him immensely in the major's estimation, but which totally failed to produce the same favorable impression on Miss Milroy. Little as she herself suspected it, she was fond enough of Allan already to be jealous of Allan's friend. "How excessively absurd!" she thought, pettishly, as if either papa or I considered such a person of the slightest consequence. "You will kindly suspend your opinion, won't you, Major Milroy?" said Allan, in his hearty way, at parting. "With the greatest pleasure," replied the major, cordially shaking hands. "And you, too, Miss Milroy?" added Allan. Miss Milroy made a merciless formal bow. "My opinion, Mr. Armadale, is not of the slightest consequence." Allan left the cottage, sorely puzzled to account for Miss Milroy's sudden coolness toward him. His grand ideal of conciliating the whole neighborhood by becoming a married man underwent some modification as he closed the garden gate behind him. The virtue called prudence and the Squire of Thorpe Ambrose became personally acquainted with each other on this occasion for the first time, and Allan, entering headlong as usual on the high road to moral improvement, actually decided on doing nothing in a hurry. A man who is entering on a course of reformation ought, if virtue is its own reward, to be a man engaged in an essentially inspiriting pursuit. but virtue is its own reward, and the way that leads to reformation is remarkably ill-lighted for so respectable a thoroughfare. Allan seemed to have caught the infection of his friend's despondency. As he walked home, he, too, began to doubt, in his widely different way, for his wildly different reasons, whether the life of Thorpe Ambrose was promising quite as fairly for the future as it had promised at first. End of chapter 6. Recorded by Michael Anthony Petronic.